Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, up to 15 new bills on top of the Great Repeal Bill could be needed to deliver Brexit. That's according to a new report from the think tank, the Institute for Government. The report also warns that Parliament is unlikely to have much time for legislating anything non-Brexit related and may have to find alternative ways of achieving policy aims. Well, we're joined now by Jill Rutter, who co-authored the Institute for Government report. Welcome to the Daily Politics. So do you think Parliament is going to struggle with the bills that it will have to push through Parliament?
This is a huge, big additional workload for Parliament. So the Great Repeal Bill itself is, in many ways, the sort of probably the least interesting of the pieces of legislation, but it's a massive task. David Davis himself said potentially thousands of pages of secondary legislation coming through under that. And then we've got major new bills that we'll need to put in place, things like the new migration regime, new customs regimes, new agriculture policy. And you can imagine that MPs want to get stuck into those. And none of these planned, of course, when the Conservatives ran for government in 2015.
Right. What will that do to non-Brexit legislation?
Well, we estimate, figures we've heard suggest there'll be 10 to 15 Brexit bills, and maybe of varying sizes, plus the Great Repeal Bill. When you take that into account, and you phase them between two sessions, that's sort of 5 to 8 bills in each of those sessions, loads of secondary legislation as well. Normally in a Queen's speech you get about 20 bills being introduced, so you could say up to around half of your conventional legislative programme may have to be displaced.
Right, you warn that secondary legislation could end up being used to amend primary legislation, what's called Henry VIII clauses. This would mean less parliamentary scrutiny. So are we going to see more rebellion against the government as a result?
Well, we've seen government trying to take Henry VIII powers before and Parliament revolting against that. What we say is basically the government needs to play fair by Parliament. So government needs to be clear that actually all it's trying to achieve in the Great Repeal Bill is putting existing European law into UK law. It should resist the temptation to make lots of changes. There's loads of time for that after Brexit. Where it needs to really change things, it needs to do that through primary legislation. And it also needs to give Parliament the information it needs to make sensible decisions in advance, draft legislation if that's feasible, proper white papers, proper impact assessments, so Parliament can actually really understand what it's being asked to do.
All right, Jill Rutter, thank you very much. We're joined now by the UKIP MP Douglas Carswell. Welcome to the Daily Politics. I mean, you've no doubt seen the report's conclusions and just listened to that interview, that the government is going to have a fairly complex, time-consuming few years ahead of it, navigating Brexit. Are you surprised?
Well, self-government takes a lot of energy and effort, and if anyone in Whitehall or Westminster think it's too much effort, perhaps they shouldn't be in the business of making public policy. Look, I think Jill and the Institute of Government have done a really good job of actually outlining some of the things we need to consider, and I think the basic principle, which I hope we can get cross-party consensus on, is that no one should really make changes to public policy, and this Great Repeal Bill should actually become a great transfer bill. If people want to make changes to public policy, I would love to see higher environmental standards. Put that in your 2020 or your 2017 general election manifesto. Get a mandate from the people. Don't try and do it on the sly.
Right. Do you think that would work? I mean, if you take Douglas Carswell's blueprint there, that you do the Great Repeal Bill, you take all this European legislation, you bring it into British law, and then you can spend a bit more time bringing in legislation to affect agriculture or immigration.
I think the problem is, because it's called a repeal bill, it does sound like we're going to start with a blank sheet of paper. I was going to call it the Great Adoption Bill, because the truth is many of the rules we have, we actually put forward to the EU, and it will be about just reasserting that we want them on the stocks, and there is time down the road for any political party in a general election or what have you to put forward their own changes in the future. And actually Theresa May in her 12 objectives said things like, I want to keep employment protection. Yep. Fair enough, and she even said enhance it, but that means she can accept what we already have as part of our EU agreement in terms of some of the issues around employment rights.
Right, but
that would be good.
But do you accept that there are going to be bills and there are going to be areas of legislation that can't just be adopted, to use Caroline's term, in the Great Repeal? Let me just give the examples, and that will need, and the Institute of Government has said, different systems to be set up.
Yeah.
So if we have a new immigration system, one that we haven't had before, because we were guided by EU principles, then we're going to need primary legislation. That is going to take time. If there are 15 of those bills, is that going to be done in 2 years?
Well, self-government, as I said, takes
right.
time and effort.
But I'm asking you, will it be done in those 2 years?
I think it will. I mean, to be fair to the Institute of Government, they've highlighted some really important things, but the Institute for Government tends to take a view of the world that reflects the opinions and the priorities of mandarins. And so, unsurprisingly, they're calling for more mandarins. Now, I respect their point of view, but I think they perhaps over-exaggerate some of the complexities. But, you know, given that they're looking at this from a mandarin point of view, that they're bound to.
All right, well, let's take their point of view. I mean, is the government preparing for this volume of legislation?
Well, I'm sure it's preparing for this legislation, but it isn't the primary legislation that will take the time, it's the secondary. And if forgive me for just slightly correcting you, Henry VIII powers aren't about secondary legislation. It's when the Secretary of State is granted powers to do them without reference to Parliament. Now, secondary legislation takes place all the time in Parliament, morning, afternoon and evening, and sometimes it's a devil all the job to get people to serve on those committees. So it's got to go about in a reasoned way.
Right.
And it is we are going to need to make some slight changes, and it will have to take place there.
But there were revolts when the government did try to use those sorts of clauses to try and change legislation. That had to be dropped. I mean, would you be happy, Douglas? Is it normal? And
It's
there's going to be
normal.
revolts over
Henry
all
VIII clauses aren't normal, but secondary
Right.
legislation.
But are you happy for less parliamentary scrutiny over what could be important pieces of legislation?
In terms of just transferring the status quo and making the status quo from an EU to a UK status quo, I don't really see the need for a great deal of debate before the next general election. But, you know, on the broader point, there are 3 stages by which a radical idea like Brexit is accepted by the status quo. Number 1, where the Institute of Government was 6 months ago, is to say it's an unthinkable idea. Number 2 is to get to where they are now, which is to say it's impractical, nice idea but wouldn't work. Stage 3 is for them to say it was their idea all along. The Institute for Government and others are making that journey towards accepting this radical idea.
Do you think it will offer more opportunities for rebellions and dissent if this is the way the government has to push through bits of legislation?
Look, I think there will be areas where there'll be consensus on, because we're just adopting in terms of our own law what was EU law. What it will identify are the points of contention, and no doubt on that there is likely to be different views, not just across the chamber, but maybe within the Conservative benches as well.
It's going to be a hard slog, but it'll be done.
Right, a hard slog, and it'll be done in the 2 years.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the thing is, we don't know, do we, at this point, sitting here. It depends on your viewpoint in how this is all going to be handled. But if there is that amount of pressure being put on Parliament, and we haven't even talked about the domestic legislation aside from Brexit, could it delay the whole process of leaving the EU?
Mean, let's be frank, over the past couple of years, Parliament hasn't actually introduced much in the way of flagship primary legislation. The tail end of the Cameron coalition.
So you think they could cope with more work?
I think MPs could cope with a bit more work. Often MPs actually have been passing declaratory legislation to look busy rather than getting on with fundamental business.
Is it going to squeeze out the domestic legislation?
Agree with that.
Do you? What, you think Parliament's been lazy then in terms of what it's had to do?
I think in the last few years, the last couple of years, it has been declaratory. And I think this is the big change. This is going to involve bringing all legislation back. So we are going to be busy. We're going to be busy all the time.
Yes, but what about the domestic legislation? I mean, aside from Brexit, will there be any time or room for any of that?
But this is domestic legislation.
Well, I mean, but aside from Brexit,
So I think first and foremost this will be the priority, and actually in the last Parliament we had too many days was one-line whips and we weren't actually discussing primary legislation, and that was lazy government. On domestic policy, the problem at the moment we've got is, actually domestic policies are being made up, like the grammar schools, like the stuff on tax the other week, and that isn't a problem of Brexit, that's a problem of
I must just get Eric Pickles to answer that policy is being made up on the Hoover Court and Caroline Flint on grammar schools.
I don't accept that, even slightly. But I do think there is a case for Parliament to sit for 5 days a week for the next few years to get this thing through, if necessary.
Right, what do you think about that?
Fundamentally, Joe, the grown-ups are back in charge. For the first time in 20, 30 years, we've got grown-ups running a government, and it can be done.
Right.
It's a big ask, but with the grown-ups in charge, we can get there.
Right. When are you going back into the Conservative Party? You're talking about the Conservative government.
I give compliments to ministers when they do the right thing. It's my job.
Right. What about sitting 5 days a week?
Fantastic.
Yes, I thought you'd be up for it. What about you, Caroline Flint?
Some of us don't live in London. We actually live in our constituencies and other. I think we should.
You could pair with George.
Can I just finish what I said? No. I think we should protect the constituency. But actually, the days when we are in London, too much of it is one-line whip days. Too much of it is not government business sorting out. And I think we should actually make sure that this area of policy gets the time it deserves. And I think we could do that if we looked at the way we run the
How
week.
would George Osborne cope, Eric Pickles, with all those other jobs if he has to sit 5 days a week?
I have to get up a bit earlier.
Is that your answer to
Here's my
the
answer.
All right. Douglas Cotswell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lord King, Mervyn King, who was Governor of the Bank of England through the good years and the bad years in the decade up until 2013. He was at the midst of many of the traumas of the time and wrote his account of what had gone wrong in a book published last year, The End of Alchemy. But it's been a long year and a lot has happened since, so the new paperback version of the book has a preface updating us on Lord King's views. He is, for example, more comfortable with Brexit than most other economists. I sat down with him earlier today. First, does he have any worries about Theresa May triggering Article 50 later this month?
Well, it's bound to be a complex process. So my biggest concern is not about the challenge of Brexit as such, but about whether we're going to make the decisions early enough that would enable us to make the practical planning that is important. If we're going to leave, I think we should have a simple, clean Brexit and to minimise the scale of the negotiation. There's a danger that we won't make progress in negotiations, at least within the 2-year horizon. But what follows from that is not that we say, OK, we'll give in to everything that the other side demands, is that we say these are the things that are under our control, and a clean Brexit is under our control. And there will be things that we'll want to discuss, but we have to minimise the area of negotiation. And I think the government also has to point out the potential opportunities that Brexit gives. We could restructure the way we give subsidies to agriculture. We could, for example, in Northern Ireland, which is a problem that I think deserves more attention than it's getting at present, try and have a conversation with the government south of the border. And I know they were very nervous about the Brexit outcome. I was there just before the referendum. And say to them, can we find a way of shifting the tax and tariff border from the land frontier to the sea frontier, while not disturbing the political arrangements? I think it's in everyone's interest to have an imaginative discussion about where we could go.
Well, you mean basically have a customs border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain?
And a tax, there's no reason why the rate of corporation tax in Northern Ireland has to be the same as in the rest of the United Kingdom, once we have the freedom to do that.
Just one specific one on trade, because a lot has been said about the potential for a UK-US trade deal of some kind. Would such a deal benefit the UK's trade balance or the US trade balance? Because my slight feeling is that both sides are thinking we'll sign all these deals, we'll suddenly be exporting more and bring our country into better balance. But both of us have the same problem, and I'm not sure which one of us would benefit.
We in the UK need to do something about our trade deficit. It's almost 6% of GDP. This is a massive figure. And my biggest worry about economic policy in the next few years is that all the politicians seem obsessed with Brexit. And actually the biggest problems we face now are not Brexit. It's about how we can reduce the trade deficit, how we're going to save enough as a nation to pay for our pensions, because the pension scheme has deteriorated over the last 25 years. How are we going to save enough to pay for care for the elderly when we all become so old that we need that support? How are we going to finance the NHS? These are the big economic challenges. And if politicians ignore those and focus only on Brexit for the next 2-3 years, then I think those big questions will not receive the attention which they deserve.
And you think they might be giving too little weight to those while their mind is off elsewhere?
Well, it's clear that their mind is now completely on Brexit, and I think that's unfortunate.
I just want to briefly talk about Scotland, which you mention in your book. You say it would have been perfectly viable as a nation at the time of the last referendum. Project Fear perhaps was overdone at the time of the last referendum. The oil price is much lower now. The revenue Scotland would derive from oil is much lower. Do you still think Scotland would be viable as a nation?
Well, of course, Scotland certainly could be an independent country. There are plenty of small countries the same size as Scotland. Scotland has both the people, it has the capital city, the history, the culture. It could be an independent country. The question is, does it want to be, given the consequences of it? Now, I myself don't think there are any major problems in terms of currency. That was the thing that Project Fear focused on last time. But there is an issue about public finances. And if the oil price remains low, and if they lose the money which is transferred from the rest of the United Kingdom to Scotland, then they would have to make that up in their own budget. But that's a consequence of deciding to be financially independent. You end up paying for yourself. And it would be a challenge, I think, to borrow on the international market if Scotland decided to run a large budget deficit. I think that would be expensive. The interest rate would go up. But that's one of the consequences of saying, look, if we want to be independent, we have to accept the consequences.
What about the banking system? I mean, Donald Trump, one of the things he has said he wants to do is revise Dodd-Frank, the big post-crisis regulatory change in the US. He thinks it's getting in the way. He wants a more deregulated environment. A, is that the right approach? And B, are you worried about the fragility of the global banking system still, which is a sort of 2 years on since you wrote the first edition of your book?
So I think that there is an argument which can be made to support part of the move that President Trump wants to make, which is we've made the regulatory system incredibly complex. People who work in banks have to go to their compliance officer before they can do anything. What regulators have done is to produce literally tens of thousands of pages of regulations and say, well, you must obey each of these. And they've done it in order to prevent a repetition of what happened before. But of course, the next financial crisis that comes along won't look quite like the one that happened before.
Are you scared of any banks having a run on them in the next couple of years?
Well, not in the UK or the US, no. But I think that elsewhere in the world, there have to be concerns about the banking system. In Europe, the banking system is still fragile. We've seen concerns about the financial sector in China. There are other parts of the world. And I think the thing that everyone needs to be concerned about is if you get a serious problem in the banking sector in one part of the world, it can quite easily lead to problems in the banking system elsewhere. So our banks are in good shape. But if there were a serious problem on the continent in Europe, then there would be a blowback to our banking system as well.
Lord King, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been